First, I'd like to hear actually Ewan's reactions to the sweeping talk we've had with Brett. Can you go into what you think about that, Ewan?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed Brett's insights, which I'm not surprised because I've also greatly enjoyed his books and shorter pieces I've read by him. But the key insight for me from Brett's contribution today is the model, the story of the energy transition that we've been working towards in Scotland and across the UK is redundant and wrong. I think that the idea that there's a straightforward transformation from a carbon-based, oil and gas-based system towards one based on renewables, and that will come with plentiful jobs and export revenue is completely inaccurate. And I'm increasingly convinced by that. I think Brett's most recent book, The Price is Wrong, sets that out very clearly. Wind power is not going to be a hugely profitable industry. And actually that's probably a very, very good thing for the future of the planet and the future for Scotland. But it isn't a very good thing necessarily for the interests that currently dominate our wind industry and our vision of an economic future where energy exports from the carbon economy, from the oil and gas sector, are straightforwardly replaced by renewables. And I think that really has been the story that we've been working through for a very long time. You know, the Salmon quote about the Saudi Arabia of renewables is just one example, and I don't think he was alone in thinking that. And actually I think our current UK government shares many similar assumptions to the Scottish government in that respect. I think that's really, really, really important. And you know, we need to think about, on the one hand, the dangers and costs of that assumption being undone. But on the other hand, I think we should really be thinking about the opportunities that come with this. We're moving from a system that's based on energy being rare and being expensive and therefore profitable. You know, in the form of coal, but even more so oil and gas, these carbon deposits are relatively rare in their distribution, and they're concentrated in particular parts of the world, hence why Saudi Arabia can be the Saudi Arabia of the oil and gas economy, and hence the role that the North Sea has played in Scotland's economy. I don't think it's controversial to suggest that a world economy that's based around oil production has been not just environmentally but also economically and politically very volatile, very dangerous, and often very disadvantageous for most people living and consuming within it. We need to think about what energy abundance could and should mean. You know, it should mean transitioning towards an economic and social model where energy isn't scarce, where pensioners don't freeze to death every year in Scotland. We should also be thinking, you know, we had this discussion around data centres, but what are the alternative, more socially useful forms of energy consumption that we could develop in this country? I'd rather it wasn't ones that encourage my students to cheat on their essays, to be honest. And, you know, we could actually look for alternatives. In the past in Scotland and in Britain, we did actually have industrial and energy policies that worked towards that end. For instance, we had the development of aluminium smelting industries in the Highlands in Scotland and also in North Wales that were based on the consumption of surplus electricity. I'm not saying that's the future, it's aluminium smelting, that's what we need to do, but we should at least be thinking around that. And I guess the last thing I want to say before I hand over to Joyce is we also need to be thinking regionally within Scotland, that actually, you know, the places that are going to lose out most from the transition away from oil and gas are the Highlands and Islands in Aberdeenshire. They're not north east and north of Scotland, they're also the Northern Isles and Shetland and Orkney, and to some extent the Western Isles as well. They got a terrible deal, really, in many respects, as regional economies out of the transition towards oil and gas. They had some benefits from them, but not enough. I have interviewed people in my research in Shetland who grew up in fuel poverty within, they could see Sullom Voe oil terminal, Europe's biggest oil and gas terminal, from their windows. And now these are the same regions, the same islands, the same localities that are at the centre of Scotland's renewables developments, and they're not seeing the same collective benefits again that they should be. And so I think it's important that we're quite careful actually when we have this discussion in Edinburgh or in Glasgow or in Dundee indeed, where we think about the different regional economies that are at stake here and this transition as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So before we go into the big substantive question for this panel, do you want to comment on any of
The question that someone asked in the audience just towards the end of the session with Brett about how you strike the balance between maintaining a grid that is viable, but also encouraging the huge potential for local control and empowerment that lies in renewable energy. I mean, I think that could be truly transformative if we find a way of doing it. And I mean, I agree that running down the grid, which is an important national resource, and just letting it die is probably not a good option. But I also think going into this sort of second quarter of the 21st century with a heavy dependence on grid electricity is also a danger in terms of security. You know, if you've got a big grid running which can be attacked as a kind of single entity at certain key points, it is much, much better for the resilience and the security of your society also to have strong sources of local energy. And when you think of the potential that renewables offer for that, particularly in a country like Scotland, which has ample water and wind resources, and actually enough sunshine to make a big difference if every house has a solar panel, then you know we really could be looking at not only at a much greater resilience for local communities, but also at more empowerment and more control of their own destiny for local communities. So I think it would be a really positive change if we could somehow find a way of integrating that into the maintenance of also what would also be a viable grid, which is of course much more important for people in cities and so on. And it occurs to me that one way of doing that, of course, is to offer people who have local sources of power an incentive to supply any surplus to the grid, so that they've got a motive to stay connected to the grid and don't just go off grid in the kind of Australian scenario that Brett was talking about. So we need to be thinking about all of these things. And so far, I must say, I think as Ewan's just said, the push towards renewables has been very hung up on the idea of just replacing the previous forms of energy with this new form of energy. And of course, every form of energy is different. You know, you can see if you look back at the history of energy, from water power to coal to gas and oil and now to renewables, that every source of energy brings its own dynamics and its own psychology, if you like. And we have to be thinking much more about what the actual dynamics of renewable energy are and how we can get the best of those and try to minimise the risks that it also entails.
Fabulous, thank you. So the big substantive question to kick us off is, where do you think we would be if we had voted for independence in 2014? So you go looking at energy, looking at economy, all of those things. What's your thinking, Joyce?
Well, I think anyone who pretends to know the answer to that question is having you on, as it were, having a laugh. I really don't know where we would have been. I mean, just for a start, Scotland voting yes to independence in 2014 would have impacted the UK like an earthquake. So maybe we would never have had Brexit. Maybe England, you know, would still be in the EU, and we would be struggling to get in because of the dynamics of that situation. Maybe the shock of Scotland leaving would have driven English and Welsh, or you know, the kind of remaining UK politics in a different direction. I have simply no idea. Although, if you look at the example of Ireland, it was amazing how once they made up their minds to it, the British establishment did actually help Ireland to disentangle itself fairly quickly and set up all the necessary institutions. I would bet that blooming deterrent would still be sitting there at Faslane, although there would probably now be a plan in place to move it somewhere else eventually. I would be prepared to bet that the economics of the whole situation would be very hairy, particularly if we had pursued the plan of continuing to use sterling, which would have effectively meant that in many of the key economic ways we weren't independent at all. And as was said at the end of the last session, in any case, if we hadn't started to think very clearly and quite radically about how to take more control of our own resources resources in a situation where we've had, however many decades of neoliberalism, where Scotland's economy is very much tied up in that, and where we're not in the situation, say, that Norway was in the early 1970s, when it was laying down the basis for its now massive oil wealth. We've had another, since then, 50 years of kind of power being centralised on big corporates and governments being increasingly heavily influenced by them. It seems to me that unless we had thought very clearly and very radically about how we were going to negotiate more control of our national resources, we would still be stuck in the old situation outlined in the Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil 50 years ago, which is that people do not own the land, that people do not control the land, and for land you can read all of the natural resources of Scotland. And we would still be in that situation unless we had developed a fiendishly clever plan for escaping from that situation, and we had had some extremely powerful and charismatic negotiators on the job. Now, that might have happened, I don't know. But, I think it would have been a tall order, and so I think the likelihood is that we would have been guddling along in a situation that would be a bit disappointingly similar to what we're in now. However, that doesn't mean that it would have been a bad idea. I still think that if we had voted yes at that time, we would at least have had a few more levers in our hands for determining our own fate. We could have, if we'd handled it well, been on a track to a much more secure and positive future. If the Brexit had gone ahead despite our departure from the UK, we would certainly be in a better position, because we would be on our way back into the EU, or we would be on the verge of that, I would think. And I think that the EU, particularly in the wake of a Brexit, would have been very welcoming towards us. So the potential for the kind of better future that you can see in all of the small countries of similar population around us here in Northwest Europe and in the Baltics would have been there, in a way that kind of positive perspective just isn't there at the moment. At the moment, it is really unusually difficult to imagine positive futures, and without the idea of independence as an option. And therefore, I think we would have been in a better place in psychological and in sort of political planning terms, but we probably would not have been yet in a much better place.
Ewan, what chance is there of a just transition in an independent Scotland?
It depends who's running it.
22%.
And by who's running it, I don't just mean who runs the government. I think actually what this conversation has been helpful about doing so far is actually thinking about where power lies in society, and maybe particularly where power lies in our energy system. On the one hand, I was quite pleased to see the National starting a discussion about the legacy and history of oil and gas. After all, I spent a lot of my time thinking about that. I thought it was, though, a bit unfortunate recently that it posed that history in terms of Westminster versus Scotland. If we think about where the wealth and power has often lain in the North Sea oil and gas industry, it's actually lain with Britannica House, BP in London. It's lain with Shell. It's lied in the United States. Increasingly, actually, our oil and gas industry is controlled from the City of London. It's smaller independent companies, because those big majors have actually left the North Sea. And I think it's really important that when we're thinking about transition in a Scottish context, we're usually thinking about the North Sea. That's what we mean, really, isn't it? We're thinking about tens or perhaps still hundreds of thousands of people whose livelihoods depend on oil and gas extraction, who might not work offshore, by the way. It's also important we understand that workforce includes helicopter pilots, it includes caterers, it includes people who work in laboratories, people who have important skills that we should be using to build a greener economy. And we're, when we're having that discussion, we should be thinking about the forces that they're subjected to. Now, oil and gas production actually peaked in the North Sea in the late 90s, early 2000s. the workforce has been in particularly sharp contraction for the last 10 years. The NGO Uplift, who I think do a lot of good work on North Sea transition economics, they've estimated that more than 100,000 jobs have already been lost in the North Sea since 2014. They've not been lost because of green transition policies or because of legislation that was passed by that dastardly Ed Miliband at Westminster, as certain people broadly on the right of Scottish and British politics would have us believe. They've been lost for essentially geological and economic reasons. So the North Sea Basin, no matter what happens with future legislation, is not going to be the employer or producer that it was. The most profitable easy to access oil has been taken out of the North Sea already. So an unjust transition is unfolding for those workers already. A just transition would require a willingness on the part of, if it was an independent Scottish government, frankly if it is the current UK government, and a willingness to take on the power of multinational owners, of financial interests and private equity interests, which Brett Christophers has explained dominate our economy in the UK, but also dominate our economy in Scotland. That would take a willingness that we've very rarely seen. We perhaps saw bits of it in Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell when they were attacked within the Labour Party for articulating that point of view. We've rarely seen it in Scottish politics either, I would argue. I think all too often the current owners and controllers of the oil and gas sector are presented as potential allies and partners in the transition to a greener economy. And I don't think that should be the case, but if it is going to be the case, we should at least radically redraw the basis on which we draw those sorts of partnerships, and we should be asserting our sovereignty over what ultimately are meant to be our resources collectively and for future generations as well.
If you wish to leave a record of your call, please state your message at the sound of the tone. Please state your message at the sound of the tone.